As you can see there, I've called the presentation Migration Through Literature, Opportunities and Missed Chances, because in my view, literature is one of the best ways of exploring migration and learning about other cultures. Obviously, I'm an English teacher. I think it's one of the best ways of doing anything. And that's what I would like to talk to you about. So next, the Brochra. So I'm going to run through an outline very quickly. So I'm going to talk about my experience of learning about migration in Scottish schools as a pupil, and then my continued journey as a teacher. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at now in secondary schools and teaching about migration through literature, both at BGE, that's Broad General Education, so that's first year to third year, and for national qualifications, so that's S4 to S6. I'll also touch briefly on what I've learned through research, both for my undergraduate dissertation and my PhD, and a couple of ways that I've attempted to kind of address issues that I've encountered in my own professional practice. So basically how my research has impacted on my work as a teacher. Next. I'm enjoying this too much. I love this. This is almost as good as my clicky pointer. So the sort of beginning of my journey was in primary school. So this was quite an interesting thing. I went to a Catholic school in the East End of Glasgow, and despite we were as all being sort of various degrees of Irish extraction, migration was never ever something that was openly talked about. So we knew that the priest, Father Bancevich, had a funny name, but he was a priest, so he could be as strange as he wanted. He was a sort of otherworldly creature. It was never mentioned, and I had really no idea that anybody could get any further than Ayr Beach. I'd kind of heard about people going on holiday to Spain, but I don't think I really believed in it. It was very much a kind of mythical place. And then I think in primary 5, we studied this book. Some of you of a certain age might recognise these covers, The Desperate Journey, The Silver Sword and The Walking Stones. And I haven't read these books since I was in primary school. But they've really kind of stuck with me over time, and it was studying these books that kind of opened my eyes to the idea that people could go a little bit further. So The Desperate Journey follows the story of a family who are chucked out of their croft in Sunderland during the Highland clearances by the evil Patrick Sellers, and they make their way to Canada via the factories of Glasgow. The Silver Sword, some of you might remember, follows the story of a Polish family who travel on foot from Warsaw to Switzerland to be reunited with their parents. And The Walking Stones is a bit of an outlier. I'm kind of maybe cheating by including it here, but I think this is a really interesting one. It's a less known book, and it's almost a kind of sci-fi story, and it doesn't really deal with migration in the sense that nobody leaves Scotland, but it's almost like a temporal migration. So they migrate, if you like, from one way of life, which is very traditional, to the other, to a more modern way of life, because their glen is being flooded to make way for a hydroelectric plant. And so these books were kind of how I awoke to the fact that people might move, but the kind of limitation on them was that migration really only occurs in extremis. People only leave their homes because of a desperate situation where they're forced to. There wasn't any idea that somebody might up sticks because of curiosity or because they wanted to. And another thing that they all have in common is that the focus is on the journey rather than the experience of arrival or the kind of post-arrival aspect. So they're mostly kind of adventure stories. The sort of migration is the narrative arc. It's also quite interesting that the authors didn't have any sort of experience of what they were writing about. They are very much imaginary stories. And I also thought it was worth noticing that The Silver Sword is the only one that deals with non-Scottish characters, whereas the others are very focused. They're very, very Scottish books indeed. Okay, so next. Okay, so I've kind of skipped over my secondary education because I honestly don't remember all that much about it. I was not paying attention. But I qualified as a teacher in 2007, and it was around about that time that increased migration from Central Eastern Europe as a result of EU enlargement really brought migration to the forefront of Scottish education. So if you read the test, it was always like migrants this, Polish that, blah, 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 blah. And as a result of that, after I finished my probation year, I returned and started a degree in Polish and Central East European Studies, which got a bit out of hand. But what that did for me was really kind of helped me empathise with the pupils who were newly arrived, because they were trying to understand processes in a language that, you know, almost bore no relation to what they had known before in many cases. And it really kind of put me in their shoes, especially when I went to study abroad and found myself in university classes in Polish, like just like a sort of rabbit in the headlights. And then a bit later on, Curriculum for Excellence was introduced. So broadly speaking, this was a more concept-based and less prescriptive type of curriculum. So it was supposed to be more interdisciplinary and allow more exploration, really, of topics that were relevant to pupils. But I think this was really hindered by the institutional structures that already existed in schools. So if I take my school as an example, at Kings Park, we all work in departments, which is lovely, but I very rarely leave my corridor. And the sort of academic blocks, so Gem and I are in the same building, and then science, technology, home economics, everything are in a separate building. PE is in another building. So having that kind of physical integration, I think, is really important. And yeah, I think that really kind of hindered this curriculum kind of meeting its aims. Then another interesting development was the introduction of compulsory Scottish set texts for National 5 and higher. So this came in 2013 and 2014, yeah. And I was a bit kind of suspicious of this when it happened. I thought it was sort of egregious nation building. But I think what it's done is really improve the status of Scots language and Scots literature in schools. So it's embedded it. And I thought this was really nicely illustrated. I was teaching my second years online yesterday. There's this one wee girl from Albania, and she asked how many languages I knew. So I asked her how many she knew, and she rattled them off. And she's like, Albanian, Turkish, French, Spanish, English, and Scottish. So the fact that she was able to kind of have the confidence to assert that she knew Scottish and knew it was different from the English that she had learned previously, I think was really interesting. After a bit, I did some work in international schools. So I worked in Prague and Rotterdam, and this was a different world again. So here, migration was very much viewed as an accepted part of life. It was something that people would want to do. People might move somewhere for no other reason than a bit of a laugh. Some teachers would plan their next job like they were planning the next holiday. There was one woman who was like, I've never been to Bermuda. That's where I'm going next August. It was excellent. And multilingualism was very much the norm, except in amongst the British and American teachers, I have to say. But because of that environment, getting ahead of yourself there, Dobrokna, because of this environment, it was more embedded into the curriculum as well. So in Prague, teaching the IB, International Baccalaureate Language and Literature course, they have a compulsory works and translation element. So pupils have to study at least one text that's been translated from another language. And there's a big list. It's very comprehensive, I think. So that's there. At IGCSE, in my school in Rotterdam, they didn't even teach the English literature, which is actually quite international, but they taught the world literature course in place of that. Then when I returned to Scotland, back to Kings Park the year before last, I found that the sort of pupil population was far more diverse than when I had left. So in Kings Park just now, I'm very pleased to say that I think celebration of linguistic and cultural diversity is really very much encouraged. So we have language masterclasses, which include Polish and Japanese. Last year, I remember we celebrated Mother Tongue Day in some amount of style. We had parents in from the community making food, but this isn't embedded in the curriculum. These are all kind of things that depend on the goodwill of teachers giving up their time and their organisation to support this, which they gladly do because they think it's important, but it's extra. Okay, next. So to where we are now in the English classroom. So first to third year, I've written that we have freedom without consistency. So at this stage, teachers are really free to kind of create their own curricula, which is fantastic. But what we taught is often very limited by, first of all, what we're familiar with. I know I'm kind of guilty of teaching what I learned about in school and what I've taught before, but it's also kind of limited, especially if you're looking to teach a novel, by what lives in the cupboard. So you go to a new school and you immediately go and investigate the cupboard and see what's there. And because class sets of text are quite a big investment, it's often the tried and tested texts that are favoured, and these get repeated over time. So in our cupboard, I found Benjamin Zephaniah's Refugee Book from 2001, which is the only one that I found in our cupboard that dealt with the post-arrival aspect of migration. Those of you who've read it, it's a really kind of nice story, and it's one of the few written by an author of colour. Obviously Benjamin Zephaniah's English. But he writes about a little boy who flees the Eritrea-Ethiopia conflict, comes here as an asylum seeker, and follows his story through fostering and adoption. And it's obviously written very much with the aim of challenging stereotypes. So this little boy, he's almost like a sort of ideal migrant. It doesn't shy away from the kind of tragic aspects of his story, but he is very polite, he's very meek, he's very hardworking, he does very well in school. And I think that's, you know, challenging negative stereotypes with positive stereotypes can have issues of its own. Okay, next, please. And then out of our Scottish set text that we teach at National 5 and higher, there's a couple of them that I've taught in the last couple of years that do deal with the subject of migration. So to begin with Sailmaker, this theme is only touched on very, very briefly. There's a mention near the beginning of the play where the main character is just out playing like round the back in the Gorbals, it's manky, and he's playing sort of cowboys and Indians with his pal. And they start making references to American comics, and it turns, you find out that they've been getting these comics from a cousin that's moved to America, obviously for a better life, and that has been achieved because they're able to send back these comics. What I thought was quite interesting is that the play really focuses on the decline of industry and the kind of tragedy of shipbuilding going into decline in Glasgow, sort of conveniently ignoring the fact that much of this industry was sort of closely entwined with the slave trade. The next one, Tally's Blood, it's migration is a much more central theme. So the plot centres around Italian migrants to Scotland, and it follows the story of one family through from the 1930s to the 1950s. And what I think is interesting about this is racial prejudice, or sort of, yeah, just prejudice based on nationality, I guess, is a really central theme. But this is mostly explored through the main character, Rosa's discrimination or attitudes towards Scottish people. So when a member of her family wants to go out with and marry a Scottish girl, she completely loses it. She's like, nope, the Scottish are loose, you need to marry your own, kind of thing. And the issue of sort of discrimination towards the migrants by the Scots only appears in one scene. So this is one of the scenes that's set during the Second World War, where their ice cream shop is attacked by a sort of angry mob, because obviously Italy was on the wrong side. So I think it's important to consider that when we're teaching these Scottish set texts, we need to, obviously I think they've done a great job just having them as part of the curriculum of promoting a more confident Scottish identity. But I think when we're doing that as teachers, we need to tread really carefully and avoid creating a sort of victimhood narrative when we're doing that. Another interesting thing that I encountered a while ago, actually, I was looking through the SQA guidelines to see if there was any information about teaching works in translation, because obviously coming from the IB course, I was used to having very strict guidelines about everything, and I couldn't find anything that said I couldn't teach works in translation for the other literature part of the course, but I also didn't find anything that said it was okay, so I didn't really feel confident to do that. But because of the way the course is examined, or the courses are examined rather, they do require a kind of close textual analysis approach, which is different from the approach that you would take if you were studying a work in translation. So it's just something that I noticed really, and something to maybe think about addressing in the future. So next, please. I'm nearly done, I promise. So, as I mentioned, all the while I've been teaching, I've also been studying and researching. So there's a few things that I've kind of picked up along the way. So my undergraduate dissertation was focused on the experience of migrants from Central Eastern Europe as a result of EU enlargement. And then I found that teachers that I interviewed overwhelmingly saw increased migration as a really good opportunity for Scottish pupils to become familiar with other cultures, but they had real issues with language barriers. And they saw this as a huge obstacle that both they and the pupils had to overcome. So, and if there's a student in your classroom who doesn't speak any English, you know, it's your responsibility to deliver what you're teaching the rest of the class in a way that's accessible to them. But without sort of bilingual or translated resources, that is very difficult to do, especially if you're talking about smaller languages like Lithuanian or Czech or something like that. Automatic translation tools are so far from adequate even now that, you know, you can really embarrass yourself if you rely on them. And then for my doctoral research which was actually how about national identity was kind of developed in the Czech education system. Just a couple of things that I picked up that were relevant. So first of all was the shift to curriculum for excellence, trying to weaken classification and framing between subjects. So breaking down the barriers that exist between subjects. But one of the findings that I had was that this can kind of allow room for dominant narratives and things that we already know and things that we already do to just be perpetuated. So just allowing space for a particular topic such as migration or something like that, and relying on serendipity to shape your curriculum without clear policy direction sort of allows these dominant narratives just to be reproduced. And it's not really down to laziness or anything like that, or lack of will. It's just that the lack of clear direction leaves teachers without the confidence to do that appropriately. Okay, next. Thank you, Dubravka. So this is my last slide. So I don't know if you've noticed the little visual metaphor I've had running through here, but I was quite proud of it. So this is just a few things that I've noticed and tried to address through my own practice. So the first one is other Englishes. So I've got a number of pupils who speak Nigerian English, for example, in class, and in their written work, they write in the way that they speak. And I find myself sort of torn between correcting it and not, because, you know, I know that they're writing in a way that is correct. It's just not the way that I know is correct. So I was thinking about ways that we can raise awareness and enhance legitimacy of other Englishes. So one of the ways I've had some success in doing that is using resources from the Moth Storytelling Project to encourage oral storytelling. And that lets people tell stories in their own vernacular, which has been really positive. Like, students really enjoy that. And I've also tried to encourage pupils to write where relevant or appropriate in their own languages. So when we have World Poetry Day, I don't know if this is a real word, the sort of macaronic poems, which are like poems that involve multiple languages. And that's something that pupils have really loved doing. And we also have at King's Park a Polish club and a Polish language masterclass. And I was amazed at the popularity of that among staff and pupils, which has shown that I think there is a real appetite for learning about these things. But again, like staff who attend the Polish club, they're giving up their lunch times and they're still doing it even during lockdown, but it is a big ask. So these are kind of things that I've tried, which have worked really well, but these are just like small moments in like a really busy and crowded school day, school week, school year. So I think to address this, using text written or published in other languages or multiple languages would be amazing if we were able to access them. Obviously, this is getting easier now. All pupils have their own iPads, and so if we find things online, we can use them. And I think technology is going to be really important in allowing that. And I think another thing is just improving teachers' literacy in other languages, because translation tools really do have their limits. And even if you're not ever going to become fluent in another language at our advanced ages, just having the confidence to know if something's absolute nonsense or if it vaguely makes sense is really useful. And another thing that I was thinking would be a nice idea would be maybe to establish some kind of translational research partnerships where academic findings from like projects like this could be translated into practice a lot more quickly, rather than going through multiple levels of policy, could work directly with schools and teachers. So that is me finished. You'll all be glad to know. So thank you very much and have a lovely day and enjoy your break.